extended episode of The Briefing, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. So we're here today to talk about an alternative to policing in Houston, healthcare providers as first responders. Joining us today are Commissioner Rodney Ellis, Council Member Letitia Plummer, Texas Organizing Project Lead Organizer Devin Branch, Cahoots Healthcare First Response Program Operations Coordinator Tim Black, and the author of The End of Policing, Professor and sociologist Alex Vitale. Thank you all for joining us. Now let's start with just a little context. Weeks of protests continue in response to ongoing police killings of Black Americans. And as a whole, more than 1,000 civilians are killed each year by police. Calls are mounting to defund policing and reinvest that money into education, housing, and community-based services. And while some elected officials have responded by suggesting that more money go towards policing, others have taken demonstrators' demands seriously. And local leaders are examining best practices from across the country to figure out what should happen when someone has to call 911. Mayors from Los Angeles to New York to Dallas have agreed to substantial budget transfers from policing to services. And cities from Eugene, Oregon to Denver, Colorado to Austin, Texas are scaling up models of 911 responders separate from law enforcement. For example, in Austin, when someone calls 911, they get the option of selecting mental health service responders. Harris County, which contains Houston, has a model crisis intervention team that does include health expert first responders. But the program is connected to law enforcement, a model that has generated criticism. That program, along with the entire Houston policing program, is now under review. And as Houston tries to put best practices from across the country into place. Now let's get started with our discussion. Council Member Plummer, I'm going to start with you. So you recently proposed an alternative to police budget amendment in Houston. It was not included in the budget and instead referred to a committee. So what's happening right now with your bill?
Thank you for allowing me to be on this show. I really appreciate all the actions that you have all taken and the focus that you're bringing to police reform. So yes, I made recommendations to a budget amendment that would allow dollars to be attached to each individual level of reform that I felt was necessary, and then hundreds of thousands of people in the Houston area felt is necessary as well. The amendment was not voted on, and it was referred to committee at this point. And we had a 7.5-hour public safety committee meeting yesterday. And most of it was just people just still expressing what they still wanted to see in terms of police reform. These recommendations will now be taken to a task force that the mayor has created. I think it's a little bit over 40 people, and they will now take those recommendations and see what types of reform can move forward from that.
And Councilmember Plummer, you mentioned Mayor Sylvester Turner. And he recently proposed the police reform task force that's supposed to review policing rules of engagement as well as national best practices on 911 response systems, including health. So what are your thoughts on the mayor's task force?
So I'm unsure now. I did see the list of who's on there. Haven't really been able to really dive in and see what the purpose is or how the task force is going to be broken down, if it's going to be in sections. It's a pretty large task force. So I'm not sure how he's going to organize it. So I'm still waiting to see how that looks. But what I will say is that sometimes just initiating that conversation and doing it in a bold way that I feel like our at-large Ford office did is really forcing and pushing the issue, making sure that our administration knows what's important to us and that we have to move with the times, and police reform in a different way is crucial, especially with the amount of mental health issues that we're seeing and focusing on now. And so it's kind of a wait and see. We've made our amendments. Everyone is talking about them. They've been supported by Commissioner Ellis, which I'm so grateful for as well. And so we'll see how this pans out, but we'll continue to have the conversation and implement as many of them as possible.
Thank you, Council Member. And as you stated, bold steps are so important right now. Now, shifting our discussion to Commissioner Ellis. Last week, you wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post calling for a reckoning on race, in which you discussed shifting first responder responsibilities away from police and to health experts. Why is that shift, in your opinion, so important for protecting Black communities and really vulnerable communities in general?
I want to thank you for inviting me, and I want to thank you for the work that you all do. And I'm glad to be with so many like-minded people. Look, we got to reimagine how we protect communities. And we got to realize that we really put too much responsibility on law enforcement. Cops can't solve all our problems. And if it's a mental health issue or something else that comes up, we ought to not think about the first place you ought to call as the end all being the police department. You know, I just want to give you a couple of stats. Being in Texas, so deep here in the heart of Dixie, despite some of the progress we have been able to make, just a few facts. We got Texas, the state has the 6th highest incarceration rate in the nation. Now that's higher than any other incarceration rate pretty much on the planet. Harris County is about almost 5 million people. It's larger than 26 states. Interesting dynamic. You got more people in unincorporated Harris County than you have in the city of Houston. So it is a tremendous responsibility. Our incarceration rate is more than double that of the entire state of Minnesota's, just the county's rate. And we have nearly twice as many people in Harris County jail as you have in jails in New York and Cook County. So right now, only the Los Angeles County Jail. LA County's 10 million people. We 5 million people. That's the only jail that has a larger number of people than we have. Most of these folks, council member, good to be with you, are people that we get from the Houston Police Department. So I think it's time to look at what we're doing, look at some of the root causes. If there's a disturbance, people shouldn't always call the police department, or they ought to have the option, as you said, Summer, earlier. Now, from looking at county government, so I've been in politics a long time. I was on city council a long time ago, council member, and in the state senate for 26 years, but now I've been in this job about three and a half years. The best county model I've seen has been Eugene, Oregon. And they've done a good job. The Justice Collaborative has helped me a lot on doing due diligence on best practices around the country. So look, I want to say this, because I've been in politics so long, as I look back over my career, there are some phrases that I used in time that maybe if I had it to do over again, I would have used a different phrase. Maybe it's a generational thing. I won't use the term defund because I don't want to lose some votes that I might get. But let me tell you, how we spend our money individually, in our business, in our household, in our state, in our city, and in my county is really a statement about our values. And in the case of Harris County, budget about $5 billion, general revenue, about 45% of that would be the sheriff's department, the constables, before I get to the DA, everything else to run the system. Where you spend your money is about your values. So if you want to do something other than what we've been doing, here are your options. You can come up with more money. You hate to use that T word, tax. You can come up with more money. You can move around the money that you have, but that's a big fight. Or you can look for efficiencies in what you do. So as we go through this dialogue, I'm telling my political folks who've been around, that I know, new ones that come on the scene, Sometimes language matters. Words are powerful things. But look, this moment's not going to last forever. So at Harris County, everything I could think of and my colleagues could think of, we put it up. Some of it you couldn't do right away. You know, you got to look at best practices. I want to do it quick. We created a new department called Justice Administration Department to just focus on these issues. We kind of followed a lot of what they do in King County. I was told King County out in Seattle among county governments is considered one of the most progressive ones in the country. They even changed the name King from some slaveholder to Martin Luther King. So they kept the King name, but it's no longer, and they created an Office of Equity. They have some version of the Justice Administration Department. We sent everything we could think of, cite and release, all of the things we've been talking about, because we have new leadership here. Judge Hidalgo won countywide. She was 27 when she won. She thinks like she's been around 100 years. Brilliant, well-educated, former Sheriff Adrian Garcia. And so we three, to the extent we can agree. So we put down a long laundry list of things. Some we got from you all, by the way. But then I wanted to put a marker on there. I would not use the phrase defund that some of my allies that I've worked with from my work as chair of the board of the Innocence Project for about 14 years, I wouldn't use it. Said maybe it's generational. But I put down a marker, $25 million in right now money that we're committing to put into these alternatives as a minimum. We do our budget, it comes up later in the year, council members. So we were not going through the budget right now. But when it does come up, you know, the options will be, I'll tell my colleagues, R's and D's. The options are efficiencies, more money, which means the T word, or you got to redistribute what you have. And it's all about solving the problem. So I hope that gives you an overview. A little long-winded, and I want to get to questions, but I hope that gives you a pretty good overview.
Thank you, Commissioner Ellis. You definitely gave me a very thorough overview, and you even answered really part of my next question. But picking up on some of the points that you mentioned, especially in reference to a community's money, where you spend your money shows where your values are. And the fact that Harris County has such a high incarceration rate, one could say that it shows that that is what is valued in the community, incarcerating people. So what has been the local political response to this call to move away from law enforcement and a push for healthcare first responders?
It's early. The constables met. The sheriff was supportive. When it's time to spend the money, that's when you'll get some sense of how people really feel. Remember this phrase I got from one of the lawyers, wish I thought of it, Neil Manning. He's part of the legal team suing my county, Harris County, on bail reform. He made the comment that everybody is for reform before they are against it. That's what you're seeing around America right now. Everybody's for reform. Even the White House is for reform. It's a shame it's not a four-letter word, because that's precisely what some people plan to do when they use that word reform. A four-letter, you get my drift? Instead of a six-letter word. But so we'll find out when we get there. These recommendations will come back with a price tag. The Justice Administration Department, we meet every 2 weeks in county government here. And I think they have an item on the agenda for about 11 new positions. They're going to have to bring in some consultants. Look, everything. Our public defender, by the way, was only handling 6% of the cases when I was elected. The office has been around 10 years now. We got it up to 12. Well, one of the items was we made a commitment. We're going to get it up to capacity to handle 50% of the cases. We're going to put pressure on to create a MAC. We're going to put pressure on to settle felony bail in Harris County. Dixie, we settled misdemeanor bail with a brilliant, well-written opinion that has really revolutionized bail around the country. Some people went farther than us, but it's too early to tell. And when his reports come back with some price tags on them, they may come back and ask for a little more time on some of them. But as much as we can do, I would say to your viewers around the country, look for right now stuff. You know, back when I used to split more verbs, I'd say right now in the South. Not stuff you talking about pie in the sky down the road, because that's when the reformers change their mind.
Thank you, Commissioner Ellis. Responding right now is really the imperative. So Professor Vitale, I'd like to bring you into the conversation now. You wrote the book, The End of Policing, that talks about the fundamental problems policing has when officers are tasked with responding to problems related to poverty, housing, substance use, mental illness, and a host of other issues. So what's happening at the national level, and why is an alternative to policing so important?
Well, we have to understand policing nationally in two ways. There's what the federal government's doing, and then there's what local governments are doing. And of course, policing is primarily a local phenomenon. We've got over 18,000 independent police departments in the United States. So right now, let's just maybe talk about the local level, where we see a growing number of departments and city governments across the country looking to create some pretty concrete alternatives. Places like Albuquerque and Los Angeles and Minneapolis are all trying to think concretely about exactly what functions we really need armed police to respond to and which ones could be dealt with in another way. And of course, mental health has been really at the top of the agenda for a lot of these conversations. And I agree with Commissioner Ellis that it's so important that we think about those things we can do right now to create momentum and a new logic. But we also need to acknowledge that just having a better crisis response capacity is not the long-term solution. We need to also look at the creation of baseline community-based mental health services so that people don't have so many crisis calls in the first place. And I think we can look at reports from the LA County Board of Supervisors, their Alternatives to Incarceration Task Force, and also the elected public advocate in New York City, Jumaane Williams, have both issued reports that kind of provide a roadmap for both what those community-based services would look like and that 24-hour crisis response capacity.
And Alex, there's a lot of discussion about reforms to policing, including changing the rules of engagement and creating community policing programs. But in your opinion, what are the problems to those calls, and how is a health-based crisis response approach or unit different?
One of the problems with community policing, which sounds good on the surface, which was really why it was created, right, to try to restore legitimacy in the existing system of policing. The problem, though, is that it imagines its role as the community brings all its problems to the police for them to work together to solve them. But what tools do the police have to solve community problems? They have tools of violence and coercion. They don't have access to affordable housing. They don't have access to community-based mental health services. They don't have access to jobs for our young people. And so while obviously everyone wants the policing that exists to be more respectful and lawfully implemented, the problem is really this over-reliance on policing to solve every social problem under the sun. And that's why I think it's so exciting, this moment where people are saying we need to look beyond these reforms that have not brought the kind of relief that people were hoping for. Then we've had 5 or 6 years of these reforms since the killing of Mike Brown and the killing of Eric Garner and so many others, and the number of killings remains unchanged. And the fundamental way that people in over-policed communities experiencing policing, it remains largely unchanged. So we have to ask these deeper questions of why we've so radically expanded the scope of policing and the intensity of policing, and look at how we can concretely dial those things back.
Thank you, Alex. Now, Tim, let's bring you in to talk about alternatives to this over-reliance on policing. You are the operations coordinator for the CAHOOTS program in Eugene, Oregon, which is a health expert crisis response unit that now takes in nearly 1/5 of the 911 calls in the area. So what makes your program work?
Thank you, Summer. I think on a very fundamental level, the reason that the Cahoots program the reason that the Cahoots program has been so successful is really simply about who's going out to respond to all of these different crises. You know, like Professor Vitale said, you know, when law enforcement responds to a situation, they're bringing with them the trappings of force. You know, a gun, a badge, even just the uniform itself. Those are all representations of the power dynamic that is inherent in the current policing system. And so by having these Cahoots behavioral health first responders come out, we are not the police. You know, we do not look like officers. We do not carry weapons. And for the public, it's an opportunity to engage with somebody within the public safety system that wasn't connected to, you know, their brother's arrest, that wasn't, you know, connected to a fatal interaction that happened out in front of their house, or, you know, down the street from their grocery store that they go to. You know, it's really that we have a different type of first responder that can come in, and that first responder that's coming into these situations with that behavioral health lens is coming with 6 months of field training in behavioral health crisis response. You know, that is coming in with extended classroom training on mental health resources, on how to approach these situations non-violently. You know, it's really that, you know, like I said, yeah, it's our program works because we have been able to find a way to have first response without the police.
And Tim, I know that you've talked to a number of elected officials across the country about implementing similar health-based crisis response programs. I mean, Commissioner Ellis mentioned Eugene, Oregon as really being a standout area where this is happening. So how scalable is this? And how much of the volume of normal 911 calls do you think this kind of program can handle if it's properly funded?
That's a great question, and that idea of scalability is really up to the individual community to really determine. You know, Cahoots doesn't operate in a vacuum. In order to divert folks from those law enforcement contacts, to divert them from the criminal legal system, from the hospital system, we need to have other destinations. We need to have other resources, and the more resources that can be implemented upstream so that that person's crises doesn't escalate to the point where they need that public safety response, then we're going to be able to achieve some really significant outcomes. You know, what we've seen here in the Eugene Springfield metro area is that there is a potential route to take to expand the program and to scale it up. You know, we're seeing the work that's happening with the Portland Street Response Project as a really good example of how a larger metropolitan area can take the same idea of a public safety response that's specific to behavioral health crises and bring it out to the public. So, you know, as we engage with other communities, you know, we are really looking at what is it going to take for that community specifically to scale this program up in a meaningful way that's going to achieve the outcomes that that community wants. Cahoots isn't a cookie cutter program. What we've built here works in Eugene and Springfield. There are a lot of components of our programming that we can lend and teach to other communities, but for that program to be successful in its city, in its community, it really needs to be developed to meet the nuanced needs of the folks that it's going to serve.
Thank you, Tim. And I know that, or at least I hope that areas across the country will continue to look to Eugene and you for guidance. Now turning to Devin. Devin, thank you for being on this panel as well. And we are looking to you to bring us home, to bring us back to what's happening in Houston. There is a version of a crisis response unit that includes healthcare experts, but it is tied to law enforcement. What are your views on how that has worked in Houston, and why are people calling for a separation between law enforcement and the healthcare response unit?
So a short answer to that question, the first part would be not well enough. And one of the reasons why I would say that is an example of a tragic killing that we had in Houston in April, a month before the tragic death of George Floyd. And that we had a 27-year-old Latino man, a father of 3, who was having a mental health crisis. You know, his name was Nicholas Chavez. And he was in need of intervention, something akin to what is provided by Cahoots. Instead of being met with that, he was met with armed police. And instead of being treated and having a de-escalation process, he was tased and gunned down in the street. So as long as these things continue to happen, I would say those services are not working well enough. Now, the reasons that people want to separate police from these things are some of the reasons that were articulated earlier, but also the fact that we know that people who are in untreated mental health crises are 16 times more likely to be killed by police than other people who are stopped by police. And we have models, such as in Eugene, such as in Portland, that have functioned, that are working, and that can be tailored to cities and scaled up. And I believe in either Portland that you've had a situation where they've been able to handle, in some cases, up to 20% of the calls for first responders. And so this is not something that can't be done. So if we know that police are more likely to bring violence and death into a situation that can be resolved, then we don't want to have them there to begin with if there's no need for them to be there.
And Devin, what has been the political momentum in Houston for creating a healthcare response agency? And have you seen that momentum shift over the past few years or just, the past few weeks?
Well, I would say certainly there has been a general momentum for reform around criminal legal system issues in Harris County over the past few years, some of which was alluded to by Commissioner Ellis. That's what led to the drive for misdemeanor bail reform to keep people from being locked in jail just because they don't have money to pay small bonds, and the bigger push for the end of cash bond, the cash bail system in general in Harris County. So much so that if you wanted to be elected in Harris County recently and you had any connection with the criminal legal system, you had to position yourself as a reformer, whether or not you were in reality. You had to position yourself that way. However, that is not the momentum that has occurred over the past few years is nothing akin to what has happened in the wake of the cruel and vicious killing of George Floyd. That was 8 minutes and 46 seconds that shook the entire world. And him being a native of Houston really had an impact on our community. And what we have seen is people not only just in the streets, in their tens of thousands, which creates political pressure, but also people going into the halls of government. What Letitia Plummer mentioned about the length of that Public Safety Committee meeting, members of our organization, the Texas Organizing Project, primarily Black and brown working class people, Black and Latino people, some of whom had never been to a city council meeting, not only went to that meeting determined to hold people accountable, they waited for 4 and 5 hours online to speak for 1 or 2 minutes because they had felt unheard for 30 or 40 years. But the fact that they were willing to stand there, not to walk away, was indicative of the determination of people to see fundamental change around these issues in our county and in our city, and so that momentum is growing. And then also there's the action that's been taken by the Commissioner's Court, by Commissioner Ellis and his colleagues in Commissioner's Court. That has created additional pressure and basically also kind of put the ball in the court of the municipality, of the city of Houston as well, and say, look, we have people moving forward in a more progressive direction. We have examples elsewhere that are working. We need to bring that to scale in the city of Houston. But the most consequential thing, and I'll wrap up, is that conversations about things like healthcare response units that used to be limited to policy experts are now being engaged in by working class Black and brown people in the city of Houston and around Harris County. So that is a huge shift. Things that were not talked about. We all knew that the police were a problem in the way they policed our community. But policy conversations and making particular policy suggestions in this fashion is something that is unique to this moment.
Thank you, Devin. So at this point, I'd like to pose some questions to the entire panel. So I will say the question and I might direct it to one of you, but please, everyone, feel free to let me know your thoughts on these questions. So first, recent polling by the Justice Collaborative Institute and Data for Progress found that 7 out of 10 voters support an agency of health experts as first responders instead of police. Polls showed that the same strong support for the agency, or polls showed the same strong support for the agency in Texas. So with far more people supporting such an agency than opposing it, what is the holdup in scaling up a healthcare only mobile crisis response unit? And Councilmember Plummer, can you start us off on this one?
in a lot of ways, I believe that it's the culture of what policing looks like in Texas or in Houston specifically. I mean, we have to look at our leadership. We have to choose our leadership of people that want to see reform. We have to have all of us working together collaboratively in the way that we are right now to deal with the root causes, like education, like mental health concerns, lack of equity in healthcare, those concerns, housing, affordable housing. And we have to work as a team on this. But the way in which our particular Houston is functioning has to change. And it really, unfortunately, the conversations are happening grassroots, but it really starts at the top. Our form of government is really strong. It's a very strong mayoral form of government. And so if the top of that ticket doesn't understand how important it is to make it happen and change and really believe in deep restorative change, then unfortunately it's going to be an uphill battle. But the main reason why I attached those amendments to our budget is because exactly what Commissioner Ellis said. Every program has to be attached to dollars. And if we see the issues happening, we have to commit the money to it. Otherwise, it's not going to be revered as important. And so it's in simple sentence, it's the culture. The culture has to change, and we have to change for the better.
Thank you. Commissioner Ellis, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, okay. Look, changing the mindset is a very difficult thing. In every county in the country, the jail is the biggest mental health institution in every one of them, whether it's a big county or a large county. So programs like Cahoots, now, they didn't come check with me before they came up with the name. Folks are always accusing me of being in cahoots. A lot of you all on this call, by the way. But it's hey, this is one time when we want to be in cahoots at one another. But look, you gotta hold us accountable. If you ask somebody, you may have asked a question earlier, why was there always a tendency to grow police budgets? My theory is the way it got there was, it was easier to go raise taxes and say you were putting it into law enforcement. That's what they were doing. When I was in the state Senate, I was trying to decriminalize a lot of stuff, give judges more discretion so they had alternatives to incarcerating people. And one of my staffers saw where somewhere, might have been in Oregon or Washington State, they had a veterans court. So I took the bill that I couldn't move and just threw veterans on it, and I could do it. And then for a number of years, I'd go looking for anything I wanted to try and go do it because politically, I could get the support in that area if I said veterans. I think that's why these police budgets just balloon out of control. And the reason why I think it's so important to put the financial resources somewhere other than traditional law enforcement is because chiefs change, prosecutors change, sheriffs change. It's about systemic change. You go back and look at how in this country we went from locking people up because they had a bad day, and we went overboard. And then we went overboard the other way. We shut down everything and then just started putting them in the jail. But Devin, Alex, Tim, Summer, your group, you got to stay on us, and even with where I am. And it's okay. I've told some of my friends who are in politics who get a little upset because somebody's criticizing them, get over it. Hell, if you don't have thick skin, get out of politics. Get into the ministry. You know what I mean? I don't know if I shouldn't say, I don't know if it's easy that. That's part of it. Even with all I've done, I remember years ago, some of the anti-death penalty folks were going to march on me because I was president pro tem and I had to preside over an execution. I told them, great. I got a bill where I want to give the governor the ability to do multiple reprieves. If I get you all to march on me, then I might get some votes. It's okay. And with Councilwoman Plummer, throughout my career, I've had to spend a lot of time asking for forgiveness because I didn't go ask for permission. Because if I ask for permission, they'd always tell me, don't do it. But you got to light a spark. So y'all get after it. Stay on us. This moment will pass, I'm telling you. I'm 66. I've seen it before. Whatever it is on this one that has sustained it for this many days is impressive. And it was a horrendous tragedy, but we've seen others. So we got to seize this moment and do as much as we can while we can.
Thank you.
You know, I think there's a historical element to this, right? When in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, when we were taking apart the state mental health hospitals, which were, you know, really problematic places, but we were told that there were going to be put in place community-based services to allow people to live independently. But instead, that money that was saved from shutting down these state hospitals got, in many cases, put into tax breaks for the already most successful people in the economy, this kind of trickle-down economics. And then as the mental health problem and the homelessness problem and the substance abuse problems mushroomed, that got turned over to police to try to paper over those problems, because it was not just politically easier, it was also a lot cheaper than actually creating quality healthcare services and housing supports for people who need it. So there are people who benefit from these arrangements that we've had. And so we have to be realistic about what's at stake here and bring pressure to bear by framing this not just as a technical fix, but as a question of racial and economic justice.
If I might, Summer, I saw something, you know, this thing you young people have where you can't sleep at night and you get online, you get all kinds of ideas. So I saw where somebody was declaring racism a healthcare crisis. So I asked my policy team to look into it. And as it turns out, I think Cook County, LA County, might have been St. Louis. So just like we think of on the business side, you go do disparity studies because of lawsuits. So first of all, you got to do it to keep from getting sued if you want a business program to help minority women-owned businesses. But also when you go document the disparity, it lets us know just how bad things are. That in of itself is a press release. So we're going to do an item, council member. My staff's working on it. I'm driving them crazy. And I've talked to the National Association of Counties and the Justice Collaborative. Folks have helped me on trying to put some meat on more than just a resolution. I don't want more of these resolutions that are just flowery words. But, you know, if I get the support, I might even try to put a little earmarker down for some money on it. But it is precisely, Alex, what you are alluding to. Something other than just putting people in jail. And your value statement is your money. That's what matters.
Thank you all. So, Councilmember Plummer, I mean, it's so important, your statements about shifting this culture. Commissioner Ellis, your statements specifically about traditional policing, and then Alex, your statements about really looking at the purse strings. And that brings me to my next question, which is about police unions. And what has the impact of police unions been on this political conversation about creating a healthcare unit? So who can speak about that? Devin, do you think you can start us off?
I would certainly like to speak on that, because one of the things that we found troubling is the rate of which people who are members, for instance, of the city council have been endorsed by the police union, given the general reactionary politics of the police union. So we believe it is absolutely necessary for us to begin to challenge that power, for us to begin to express the fact that we may need to consider stating to people that if that's an endorsement that you want and aren't willing to repudiate, maybe we need to consider not having you seek the endorsement of our membership. Maybe our members need to consider that. But we definitely have had a problem in the city of Houston with the police officers union, with its leadership, with the statements that they have made, not just halting progress, but actively speaking against the changes that have been made, such as bail reform. And that's not just at the patrolman on the street. The historic bail reform settlement has been criticized publicly by our faux reformer, Chief of Police Acevedo. You know, we have had a challenge with that as well in the city of Houston. So we encourage our people to keep the pressure up because as Commissioner Ellis has stated and others have stated, these moments have come and gone in the past, and people who have not seized the time have regretted it subsequently. So we cannot afford to not seize the time, and nor can we afford to not push the issue, including with people who have been our allies in the past. We have to hold people accountable, both at the county, the municipal level, and in law enforcement, irrespective to what the media has stated were their achievements in the past. We have to look at what are they doing now to answer the needs of the moment.
I think this is really important, and I really support TOP in its rethink about whether or not politicians who take those endorsements can be their friends anymore. And we've seen around the country a movement of politicians under public pressure renouncing those endorsements and giving away past campaign contributions to bail funds and mutual aid projects in their communities. It's not, these unions have gotten a kind of pass as if they're just any other labor union, but they're really not, because they're invested in an ideology, a worldview that says the solution to community problems is punitive interventions, is policing and incarceration. And that ideology undermines any kind of real progressive politics. It says that the problems of communities are the result of individual and group moral failure that can only be fixed through punishment. And when we want to say, no, we need housing and employment opportunities and better education for our young people, that is diametrically opposed to giving those unions what they ask for at the bargaining table or through the legislative process. So I think we have to have a kind of zero tolerance attitude about politicians who take those endorsements.
The police unions have been a big problem. And look, maybe in some ways I'm old school because I've been in politics so long. There's a guy in California had a famous quote, which I'll clean it up. But he said, if you've been in politics as long as he had, if you haven't figured out how to take their money, eat their food, vote against them, get out. Now, I've been blessed. I never believed in unilateral disarmament, but even before I was an old man, I was pretty independent. The union contract for City of Houston's coming up. I Googled it on the line the other day. I saw it. I have to ask you smart folks on this call to go help me analyze it. I'm a lawyer, but it was so long ago when I studied. But I did see that section in there about 48 hours before you can talk to a officer after a shooting. And I called someone and talked to him about it. I said, well, they're so stressed out. Yeah, I know what it means. I bet if I got shot, hell, I'd be stressed out too. I'd like to have 48 hours, but I bet you talk to me while I'm on painkillers. But that ought to be out. But they have been a distraction, and we ought to be willing to call them out. And I'm hoping that those unions will get on board. And if they don't get on board, we need to get after them. And on bail reform here, it's been ridiculous. I mean, there's always the possibility. Whether it's misdemeanor or felony bail, something could go wrong. But they don't say a word about all these cases where somebody has money. I always use an analogy of Sandra Bland. She didn't have $500. $500. And her life was changed. 9 a.m. Monday morning when she's supposed to go to work. Who in their right mind would move to Texas in August from Chicago in August when the weather's beautiful to take a job? A young woman who loved her alma mater, Purdue A&M University. But you take Robert Durst, the guy who allegedly chopped somebody's head off, threw it in the Gulf of Mexico. Since I used to chair the Board of Innocence Project, I have to say allegedly chopped it off. I can't remember what his bail was. He turned the money in $100 bills. I'm guessing. Google it. Might have been $1 million, whatever it was. Bond. Gave him the money in $100 bills. He gets out, skies up on a private plane. They find him sometime later, allegedly, in Los Angeles, thinking about chopping somebody else's head off and throwing it in the Pacific Ocean. But he had money. The Goins case, Mr. Floyd was arrested in 2004 from the no-knock warrant case that got a lot of press, possibly dirty cop. The unions, when that raid came up, officer got shot. Oh, they were police chief, everybody. Blaming it on Black Lives Matter.
Okay, I can hear Rodney Ellis now.
Perfect.
Go ahead,
So you
jump
can
on
just
in.
stay there, and then after they finish these.
He's in. You get my point, but yes, they have been a problem.
Thank you.
And I think before we just move, I know the contract was brought up, and that's a critical area that people in the community need to stay focused on. The Texas Organizing Project, we are working on these issues in different parts of the state as well, in San Antonio as well as in Dallas, examining those contracts and pointing out those particular aspects of the contracts where police are given things like 48, in some cases perhaps more, after a shooting before they have to make a statement, where you as a regular person, especially a Black or a Latino person, are questioned on the spot in many cases without even being given your actual just due with respect to even Miranda warnings and things of that nature. So we need to make sure we don't take our eye off the ball of those police union contracts during this year, because our contract is being negotiated this year in Houston.
Thank you. So we can get to our last question before we move on to the community question portion of the forum. What percent of 911 calls do you all think should or would go to a healthcare responder unit in Harris County? And if you think that that number might be 100%, what would it mean for policing? And for this question, Tim, can you start us off based on your knowledge of what's been happening in Eugene? And Devin, I know we'd love to hear from you from your perspective, and also Councilmember Plummer and Alex, really everyone.
Thanks, Summer. Right now in Eugene, we're handling 17% of the calls that are coming in from the public through the communication center. The only thing that's really holding us back is the size of our program. If we had more vans on the road, during the right times of day, we would likely be able to take on a lot higher percentage of those calls. When we're talking about this, though, what we really need to be asking is, why do we need to be approaching so many of these different situations with enforcement? The CAHOOTS program, behavioral health first responders, are only one component. If a community is able to adopt more community-based mediation services, right? If there is an opportunity to decriminalize issues related to mental health, to housing and substance use and abuse, if there are ways for us to increase access to those services, theoretically, there isn't going to be that same level of demand on that 911 system. So, it's a hard question for me to really answer, because, as far as I'm concerned, the sky's really the limit in what we can do, as long as we, approach this from a really, strong and coordinated place.
So I see no reason why, if they can handle up to 17% in Eugene, and he said the capacity is just limited by the allocation of resources effectively, why we could not do that at minimal and perhaps even scale that up. But I think a way to figure out how much you could do is actually to start and look at what are people responding to? What are the amounts of responses that we're getting for issues that are dealt with this way in Eugene, and say, what is the percentage of our calls that match those issues? And then that's a good baseline of what we could respond to through similar programs in Houston and through Harris County. But if we have already examples of at least 20, think of the impact of that, given the number of calls that come out. It makes more sense, because not only because it protects the lives of people who might otherwise be killed unnecessarily by police, but also there may be some situations where there may be a need for a response. And that means that people who can respond to that aren't being directed to respond to mental health issues, and are available to respond to things that mental health professionals would not be able to respond to.
I'd like to jump in on that, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, so in Houston, we've been in communication with HPD to get more detailed data in terms of how many calls come in, dealing with mental health concerns and how they maneuver those people in the whole process. And the numbers are really not as clear as they need to be. So the one thing we need to do is ask the proper questions and make sure that we can really collect actual data. What we do find, though, is up to 50% of people that die from police brutality are people that are suffering from mental health concerns, and so that's a really high number. And anyone with mental health, as mentioned before, 16 times those people have an issue with police or deal with some type of brutality with police. So does the data alone shows that we have to have more support and look at this conversation differently, but we have to have the money to support it. And my belief is if HPD is the catch-all for the lack of social services that we have, then in my mind, then there should be some level of financial commitment that they should put into the pot. Because if they don't want to deal with mental health patients and they don't want to deal with people that are homeless, and if they don't want to deal with people that have healthcare, healthcare issues, then they need to help us. They need to help us fund programs like that to make sure that those people don't fall within this criminal justice system, and it's going to make their lives better. So I am having conversations with the union. I obviously will not be or can't be in the room when the contract is being drawn up, but I am bringing these issues to the forefront. And when it does come to council to evaluate, I promise you, I'm looking at every single line, and I'm going to make sure that whatever's in that contract is supporting the community, not just the police.
One of the problems with the data here, look at the official mental health crisis calls.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, a behavioral health response capacity should also be dealing with things like substance abuse crises and homelessness related crises, which is of course what they do at Cahoots. But also a lot of things that get coded as a particular kind of criminal matter, breaking into a car, disorderly conduct, a fight. The root of that is actually homelessness, mental health crises, substance abuse. So it's actually a much larger potential universe of police calls that we're dealing with here. And I agree really that we don't know what the upper limit of that is, especially if we're actually resolving people's underlying problems in the process so that we reduce those calls of service in the first place.
Summer, I would suggest in Houston and Harris County, we look around the country, and the assumption would be if it's 18% in Eugene, Oregon, we would be more because we have the largest uninsured population in the country. We didn't draw down the Obamacare money. I think in Cook County, Tony Preckwinkle, the president, is using Obamacare money to help pay those healthcare issues. But so I would assume our number would be higher because so many people don't have access to healthcare. Add that to it. And we are probably the most diverse county in the country. I know we're the most diverse city, but so I'm assuming that our inequality index is probably pretty high as well, which compounds those other issues in terms of disparities.
Thank you all. And it really does sound like the sky could be the limit. Let's now shift to the community question portion of our forum. Our first question is going to be posed by Lauren Johnson. Lauren is the policy advocacy strategist for the ACLU of Texas. Lauren, you can please ask your question.
Hi, thank you for having me today. Yes, I think my question would be directed to Councilmember Plummer. So as Mayor Turner's 2016 Transition Committee pointed out, the policy-worn body cameras can help hold police accountable for excessive force when the public has maximum access to video footage. But what we've seen is that when police have the discretion to release those videos, they release the videos that they want the public to see. The ones that make them look good, and then they withhold the ones that don't. And so in the last 6 videos of HPD officers shooting and killing Houstonians have been not released to the public. Mayor Turner's administration has argued that individual family preferences override the public's interest in transparency about policing, and that Houston will have to wait for a federal standard before acting on transparency. But other cities have video release policies that result in quick releases of the videos in a way that protects privacy. Why doesn't Houston have a different standard than why does Houston have a different standard than other major cities? And how can the public trust Chief Acevedo or Mayor Turner and the city when there's so little transparency when officers do kill people.
I'm sorry.
Next question.
There we go. Lauren, thank you for the question. And just this past Wednesday, there was a vote on the table for about $2 million to purchase new body camera footage, body camera equipment for HPD through a grant. And I actually tagged the item. And the reason why is because I don't believe we need to buy additional equipment without creating some type of clear policy in terms of how body camera footage is going to be utilized. And so my reason for tagging it was to give Chief Acevedo an opportunity to explain to me what the policy was. The mayor kept on coming back and saying, well, it's just for funding. But it was very, very clear in the ordinance that said that the authority to gain the grant, utilize the monies in the way that he wanted to. And that's a concern for me, because if I don't know what the policy of using body cameras is going to be, then buying more cameras is not going to be the answer. I mean, we're doing better with cell phones on the street right now. We're getting more information that way. So I am fully supportive of what you're saying. I understand it. And unfortunately, we're going to have to wait for them to give us some level of what that policy is going to look like. And we've got to keep the pressure on. And as those funding elements come into place, I will speak our piece. I will try to, make comments. And I will be having a conversation with Chief Acevedo before that vote comes back up next week on Wednesday. But unfortunately, we have a very strong mayoral form of government here. And so we can't put things on the agenda if it's not supported by the administration, which makes it really difficult. And that's why I was so wanting to get funding associated with the Independent Police Oversight Board. So we could have individual investigators that are separate from the police altogether, and that would really create some transparency. And in addition, if we need a subpoena power, if that would allow for us to get the information that we need immediately, that would be there as well. So this is a long process. In a lot of ways, my colleagues seem like they're having the conversations and wanting things to change. But my fear is that we lost the money in that last fiscal year. So if we don't see these line items earmarked moving forward, I just don't know how it's going to happen. And they're pushing it off to the federal government, which is another problem, because it's just kicking the can down the road. We need to make a decision individually of what Houston is going to do and what policies we are going to have, because we're different from all the other cities. So the federal government could lay some type of overall governance, but we as a community know what our issues are and know what the focuses need to be. And so we need to make those decisions internally, and we have the capacity of doing so.
Thank you both. So our next question is going to be from Carl Nix. Carl is a bail fund coordinator for Restoring Justice. Carl, please ask your question.
Thank you all for having me, first of all. And my question is, doctors, nurses, and first responders are bound to the Hippocratic Oath, which entails they shall uphold a specific ethical standards, which include stopping and rendering aid. So in a situation like George Floyd's, where first responders have the guidance to notice that someone is in distress, however, they're denied their due diligence to perform such duties, what protections or laws that you all know or that you plan to put forth to protect the individuals if they decide to intervene and try to help the individual by, upholding that Hippocratic Oath? Thank you.
And Carl, who are you directing your question to?
It would be for anybody who can, answer it. It's not directed to one specific person.
So the floor is open.
I certainly have read around the country that there are policies being put in place that require a duty to render aid. If you're into public safety and you're working with somebody doing something untoward, I think you have a responsibility to step up, particularly when you are law enforcement and the power that you have by having that uniform on. It looks like on the federal level, I think that was in the House bill, I'm not sure. But it looks like, I know they had an impasse. I don't know if things will change. I think an election will decide it. I don't know on a local level the extent to which we can do it, but I'm certainly going to bring it up. We don't do meet and confer on the county level. On the city level, they do. You can certainly do things by contract, even if you don't have the ability to do it by law. But look, I think it's right. I'll give you a line like you talk about doctors taking that Hippocratic oath. I used to joke when I would argue about indigent defense issues, and I say the lawyers are just hypocrites, because they didn't want to go. But you can't say your responsibility is public safety. I mean, the hardware, the armor that you have, and you see something like that happening, and you don't try to stop it. Just morally, I don't know how you do it. On cameras, I think it'd be a good idea, and you all could do it for us. It'd be good to look at what jurisdictions do around the country. That's how you figure out best practices. I kind of take the attitude, the last original, look, I've been in government almost 40 years. The last original thought I heard of was something I read Socrates or Plato or somebody had it. So I always want to look and see what other people are doing, not just here, but abroad, see what makes sense. So at least you can measure your success with how you do it compared to somebody else.
Thank you. Would any other panelists like to offer a response as well?
Can I just say on the body camera thing that what I and some others have been proposing for a while now is that the police department shouldn't have control over the footage. That the footage, when it's downloaded, should be under the control of an independent agency. Perhaps in Houston, this civilian review board that you mentioned, or oversight board, or just a governmental administration office, and they establish the clear rules for when and how this material should be released, so that there's none of this monkeying around with the footage. When it shows the police do something great, they put it on the nightly news, and when it's questionable, they say, oh no, you can't have it.
Absolutely. I think it is quite clear that there is a need for the public to be able to access body camera footage, because we cannot and we need not be able to rely on cell phone videos from someone who just happens to be there observing the murder of one of our people by the police time and time again. With respect to holding police accountable when they witness and do not render aid, I know that the House passed some police reform package that began to address attacking qualified immunity, something that protects police from being prosecuted, except when the most gross standards of incompetence are met. We may need to look at those things, as well as, I think it's interesting that if you're a person arrested for a crime and let's say you went to rob a store or something of that nature with your friends or some other people, and someone was killed, everyone involved can be charged in most states with that homicide. Everyone who was involved with that action can be charged with the homicide. But in the situation of George Floyd and other situations like this, we don't see that. In most cases, we only see a single officer held to that same standard. Where in my opinion, every person who was there that was a police officer was a party to that murder, and every one of them should be prosecuted for murder. And if we don't have the legal statutes, if we don't have the statutes on the book that would allow that now, then these are things we need to consider.
You all. Our next question is from Mickey Rodriguez. Mickey is an MSW candidate at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work and a policy organizer with TAJ, Texas Advocates for Justice. Mickey, please ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much for giving me the time to speak today and ask this question, which is in regards to the oversight board. So I was one of the individuals who gave a public comment at yesterday's extremely long and exhausting meeting. And I have to say, on one hand, it was extremely empowering to hear the way that everyone that was making public comments is pretty much in a line with each other on where we stand on our calls for defunding police. But on the other hand, I can't even begin to describe how not just disappointing, but infuriating it is that we, the public, seem to hear each other so loud and clear, but our elected and appointed leaders not only seem to not be listening, but were actively pretending like they didn't understand the questions that were being asked of them. So my biggest concern is for public education and access to critical knowledge that the government should want folks to have access to in order to make informed decisions at the polls and elsewhere. So my question is for Councilmember Plummer, and I would like to first address the concerning statements from Marvin Hamilton, who's the chairperson of the Houston Independent Police Oversight Board. So first, when asked, how does one become a chairperson of the board? He said, by being a good member. When asked who makes that decision, he said, me. When asked if the board keeps meeting minutes, the answer was unclear. And when asked if the public has access to the meeting minutes that may or may not exist, the answer was a flat out no. So I want to know why. Like, why does the public not have access to that? And Councilmember Plummer, what do you believe that the mayor and city council should be doing to create a real independent police oversight? And what mechanisms will there be for the public to have access to attend the meetings, make comments, or even access the records such as the meeting minutes, the body cam footage, or even to have a seat on the board?
Mickey, I was just as disappointed in those answers. Oh, I'm mute. Hold on a second. Okay, you can hear me? Okay, I was just as disappointed as you were with the answers to those questions yesterday as well. I was kind of cringing in hearing those answers. So I want to apologize. I mean, I know that wasn't my specific, but I am your council member, and so I do want to acknowledge that I wish those answers were a lot better. In my amendment, I put aside about $2 million for the oversight board. And the reason for that is for all of the things you're talking about. We need to have people that are truly independent. If they're appointed by the mayor or administration, then unfortunately, we're not going to be able to have the control that we are. A lot of us are talking about my suggestion was it should be more of like a jury type selection, so that people can, different organizations that know this space should be able to appoint those members in a more of a jury independent selection. Some people are talking about elected officials. That particular person that leads that should be elected by his community or by the community in general. And so, but money is necessary, Melissa. Mickey, we have to have monies associated with it, because to get the data, to get the dashboard that I was recommending is going to cost money. For us to upload that film footage to an independent system, that's going to cost money. And that's why this amendment, in my opinion, was so crucial, because money had to be attached. But those were some suggestions that I made. But the jury selection piece, I feel, would be a good way of doing it. And maybe the chair could be an elected member or an appointed member by the community, and not necessarily appointed by the administration.
Our next question is from Melvin Halsey. Melvin is a formerly incarcerated veteran who's now working with TAJ, the Texas Advocates for Justice. Melvin, you can please ask your question.
Hey, let me just say thank you all for allowing me to ask this question. This is what I just have a statement, more or less, with the question. A few weeks ago, I was going to pick up my child, my son, from work. I was waiting in the parking lot, and I had the air conditioner on because it's kind of hot at night, and I'm listening to music. A lady came up to me, a white Caucasian lady came up to me, tapped on my window, and said to me that I'm messing up the ozone layer and I'm parked in a handicapped parking spot. Now, mind you, I'm a disabled veteran with disabled veteran plates. Now, I calmly told this lady, leave me alone. Because see, I have PTSD. And when I don't want nobody messing with me, I don't need nobody messing with me. So she said that, well, I'm gonna call 911 because you're not being responsible. I said, woman, please get away from me. I don't care who you call. You understand what I'm saying? Because the fact that I'm sitting here waiting for my child, minding my business, you see. And to that point, the security guard came over, and I had to explain to him, look, I'm a disabled veteran, dude. I showed him my ID as well as the DV plates that I have on there. Now, given the fact that what's happening in Floyd, behind something stupid, that lady could have called and said I threatened her or made the situation even worse. The only thing I have to ask is to you, Rodney Ellis, because you one of the realest people we got in the city of Houston. Because of this, Rodney Ellis, well, shall I say Commissioner Ellis, I want to say
Rodney.
state secrets. What I want to ask is this: what do I do in a situation like that? Because see, like I said, believe y'all me, I don't want to engage with a police officer when I'm in a certain state of mind. You see what I'm saying? I want to talk to somebody who can talk to me on a level that's calm, that's going to be helpful, because mind you, PTSD issues, very, very severe. So I don't want to end up having my child bury me or having my mother bury me. So I'm very, very concerned about this. And it is so, so vitally important that we, the fourth largest city in America, get something done about this. So if I got to donate some money, if I got to walk around the city of Houston with a sign saying, please help us veterans that have mental health issues, I'll do it. Because see, I'm not about policy and all that. I'm about change and change for the people, especially my fellow veterans. And that's all I got to say. Thank y'all very much.
Well, Melvin, I want to say thank you for your service. I mean, for you to go and serve this country when there's so many of us who went to college or something and did not do that, we do appreciate it. And I'm glad that it did not escalate into something. So what I will ask the folks to do from Justice Collaborative is when this is over, make sure they give me your number. Give them permission so I can call you. I want to make sure you have access to veteran services that we do have available. My colleague, Commissioner Garcia, took the lead on revamping our veterans programs here in the county. The city is very helpful as well, council member, but we cannot do enough for people who served us. And we'll check on just making sure you got some counseling, because we want you to be around for that young one. In your case, since she didn't call the officer and somebody didn't show up and it escalated out of control, we were lucky. But I want to make sure we at least get you access to the help that you need, help that may be able to be of some assistance to you. And you call me Rodney anytime. Look, I've been in so many different offices. I don't get hung up on that. Very little literature do I introduce myself as councilman, senator, or commissioner. That's not on the ballot. It's Rodney. Thank you.
Yes, sir. And I thank you very much, Mr. Rodney Ellis, because it's like I said, it's too important for us, because it's given everything that's happened, I don't want to become a statistic behind something that could have been just de-escalated right then and there.
Well, it's a perfect example of why that Cahoots program is so important, because if something came up, first of all, I don't think you had a reason to be calling. You got me? But no, you saw the case. Was it in Central Park or somewhere where it was on video?
Right. It was in Central Park. And the lady told the dude, I'm going to tell the police a different story, you see, and she told him that, you see, and that's crazy.
And then all those biases come out, when the officer shows up. I never discount the need for training, but I don't want us in this moment of reform for people to just get off saying, put more money into training. You got me? But I'm glad you came out okay. And so your little one.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you both. And we'll be sure that you are both connected to continue this conversation. So our next question will be asked by Brennan Griffin. Brennan is the Deputy Director of Texas Appleseed. Brennan, you may ask your question.
Hi, I am asked for Councilmember Plummer and for Commissioner Ellis. I was hoping you could have some insight into this. Mayor Turner is probably working to negotiate a new union contract with the Houston Police Union at this moment. The current contract expires at the end of the year, and we saw a really much more transparent process in Austin when they opened those negotiations up to the public, so that the public couldn't speak, but people in the public could actually show up and see what was being discussed and see what kind of agreements were being made on behalf of the residents of the city. And so I was wondering, what how do we get Mayor Turner to open up the process in a similar way in Houston? And what are some of the ways that we can try to make that process more open, more transparent, and get more of the things that the community needs, as have been discussed?
Sure. No, that's a great question. So let me just first explain to a lot of our viewers kind of how the process works. So according to what I'm understanding, the contract is negotiated, and the mayor, obviously the administration, is in that negotiation with the union, and then it's taken to legal. Legal looks at everything, and then it's brought to council as kind of a final product, and then we actually vote on it. And so what I'm going to ask, and I'm going to definitely call legal. I'll do some research. I think it's a great question, Brennan, in terms of what your recommendations are. I will look into that and see if there's any possible way we can get the document, before they actually, make it kind of set in stone, to where we can go back and forth and make some changes. I'm not quite sure if the public can actually be a part of the process, but I will definitely ask legal that question, and I will make that recommendation to our administration and see what I can do. And I would love if you would follow up with me, or if I could follow up with you with your permission, and kind of see. I would love to see what you're doing and how and I can give you some feedback and let you know, maybe you can assist me in working through that process. But I believe it should be something the public deals with. And at a minimum, maybe if we can create some type of a situation where I can get feedback and updates and what people feel should be in the contract or how it should look, and I can bring those to the forefront at our council meetings to make edits to the contract. But a combination of all of that or bits and pieces of it I would really appreciate that if we could do that together.
It's a great question, Mr. Griffin, and it's a great answer as well, council member.
Thank you.
Far too long, the unions on a local level would go to Austin and then get us to put stuff in state law in Austin, oftentimes not really reading it. So I do commend Mayor Turner for advancing those reforms on the pension side in Austin, even if some people get mad about it. It's such a large amount of what we spend. And in Austin, we weren't paying attention. Griffin, you ought to Google that contract. When the issue came up, I'm new to county government. So look, I was thinking I'm making all this noise about what other people are doing. Better check on what I'm doing over here. So I Googled the contract. We don't have meet and confer on the county level. But you ought to Google it. You ought to post it. You ought to look at it. Just that one thing I saw, then I sent it to other people. They understand it. But I don't know what the state law, to what extent it preempts involvement. But it ought to, in this age of transparency, it ought to be robust. Appleseed does a good job of digging in. You're going to see things in it right away that are helpful. I mean, Appleseed always, you all pretty much wrote the Fair Defense Act 20 years ago when I was in the Senate with a young woman on my staff. She's a Dershowitz now, but her name was Lieberman. Came out of one of the big firms, Hannah, if you were around, remember her. But y'all do a good job. You play a tremendous role on helping us on this.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Brennan, could I just add, there's nothing preventing Appleseed and the Texas Organizing Project and Taj and other groups from coming together and laying out some things that they don't want to see in such a contract, or some things that they do want to see. And the sooner you do that in the process, the more likely you are to affect those day-to-day negotiations going on between the police union and the mayor.
I think it ends.
Absolutely.
I Googled it. I think it's the end of September. You might check it. The councilman, I think we lost her. Her internet might have gone out.
Yes, and just for the record, Appleseed and TOP, we are working together with other members of the Right to Justice Coalition and policy partners to address questionable things that are currently in the police union contract.
All right, thank you, everyone. Let's move on to our last question before we do. Councilmember Plummer did have to leave, so we just thank her so much for her participation. Our last question will be asked by Josefina Reyna. Josefina is a member of Workers Defense Project. Josefina will be asking her question in Spanish, but it will be translated to English for those on the panel and for our viewers at home who are not Spanish speaking. Josefina, you may ask your question.
Gracias, buenas tardes. El día de hoy he aprendido bastante, pero aún quedan muchas dudas y seguir aprendiendo es bueno, pero el trabajo de ustedes es crear un Houston seguro en que todas las personas reciban la misma igualdad de justicia sin importar el color de la piel. Sin embargo, la policía de Houston ha asesinado a 6 personas en los últimos meses, africanas, afroamericanas e hispanas. Pero además, la policía local de Houston ha usado esta herramienta para separar familias y esforzar leyes racistas. Y tenemos demasiadas personas de color encarceladas por delitos menores. Incluso un análisis recientemente demostró que un 10% de los arrestos de la policía de Houston son de delitos menores. Es cosa de pensar. Mi pregunta es, ¿contamos con su liderazgo, concejala Plummer, para pasar una ordenanza que requiere citation o una conexión con servicios necesitados sin arresto por ofensas menores? No sé si me explico, o sea, que solo amerite el ticket o sin ser admitido a las autoridades.
Thank you very much. I've learned a lot during this panel, and we're all learning more together. Your job is to create a safe Houston in which all people receive the same equality of justice, regardless of the color of their skin. However, the Houston police have assassinated 6 African American and Hispanic men over the past months. Also, local law enforcement has been used as a tool to separate families and enforce racist immigration laws. And we have too many people of color incarcerated for minor offenses. Our recent analysis shows that 10% of HPD's arrests are for minor offenses. Can we count on you and your leadership, Council Member Plummer, to pass an ordinance that requires citation or connection to services where needed instead of arrest for minor offenses?
Commissioner Ellis, since Councilmember Plummer had to leave, would you be able to answer Josefina's important question? And I would just add too that we only have about 2 more minutes left. So
Buenas tardes, Josefina. I'm getting better.
Buenas tardes.
We do need a cite and release program. We need a cite and release program. And we've been working on it from the county side, the DA, the police chief, everybody's talked about it. It is a part of the solution. It's not as big of a part of reducing that population as I thought. Felony bail is a big one. You want to interpret? Are they interpreting? Felony bail reform is a big part of it. There was some movement with one of the judges. I hope some of the others are going to get online. We did misdemeanor bail. It was held it around the country. We got to get felony bail. And we got to get better lawyers for people who are arrested. We got to expand that public defender's office. It's so important. But I'm going to bring up cite and release this week. I don't know why it's dragged on. First, they will blame it on computer glitches. It's crazy, but stay on us, the city and the county. Thank you.
All right. Well, I just like to take this time to thank all of our panelists for being here with us today, all of our community members who were able to join us to ask such important questions. All of it just contributed to really creating such a wonderful conversation about such an important topic. Emergency first responders in Harris County. We'll see you all again next week on The Briefing, and we hope that you have a safe and pleasant weekend.